My mother waited until the appetizers were cleared to tell me I'd been bought. Not adopted. Bought. That's the word that fits once you hear the rest of it. She smiled, actually smiled, like she was announcing a wine pairing, and told me the only reason they'd ever taken me in was the money that came with me, and now that the money was gone, so was I. My father slid a stack of legal paperwork across the tablecloth before the bread basket was even empty. They'd already filed to erase me from every will, every account, every version of the family that existed on paper. Here's what neither of them understood in that moment. 6 months before that dinner, I had already found the people who were actually mine by blood. And I had sat them 3 tables behind my mother's chair that very night. She just hadn't turned around yet. What happened when she finally did is the reason I'm telling you this story right now, 6 years later, with steady hands and absolutely no regret. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we sit with the quiet kind of family stories. The ones that aren't about screaming matches, they're about the years of small cruelties that build up until one dinner, one document, one sentence finally breaks the dam. Stories about people who stopped shrinking themselves to fit into a family that never actually made room for them. If any part of what I just said hits close to home for you, you're exactly who this is for. Stick around, drop a comment when you get to the part that gets you, and subscribe, because you will not believe where this one ends up. Let's start at the restaurant, because the restaurant was the first lie of the whole night. It was called the Amber Light, and in 25 years of being my mother's daughter, she had never once taken me there. That alone should have told me everything. Renata Vance did not spend a single unnecessary dollar on me without a line item attached to it somewhere, a reason, a return she expected to collect on later. She dressed for the occasion in the same charcoal gray dress she wore to funerals and to board meetings, same dress, 2 very different kinds of burial. My father, Martin, had made the reservation under her name instead of mine. I only found that out because the hostess asked which Vance the table was under, and he answered before I could open my mouth. No banner. No candlelit cake waiting in some back kitchen with my name piped across it in frosting. For a 25th birthday dinner, the table was almost aggressively bare, and the air between my parents had that overly polite stiffness you feel right before someone reads you a verdict. I want you to understand I know that stiffness intimately. I'd spent 4 years sitting across tables exactly like it, professionally. I work in trusts and estates. I've watched families gather to sign things, to divide things, to say goodbye to a relative and immediately start fighting about the leftovers. I know precisely what a birthday dinner feels like, and I know precisely what a deposition feels like, and that night, at that table, the temperature in the room was 100% deposition. So I did the thing I always do when a room turns cold on me. I slowed my breathing down, and I quietly mapped every exit. That's when I clocked it. A small brass number standing upright on a table behind us and slightly to the left. Table 9. I filed it away in my mind the way you note a landmark before you consciously decide you might need to find your way back to it. Then I set my own item down on the tablecloth, right next to my water glass, a thin, unremarkable manila folder. My mother's eyes flicked to it for half a second. She clearly assumed it was a resume. Maybe a greeting card. She had absolutely no idea what was actually sitting inside it. To understand why none of what came next actually shocked me, you need to understand what birthdays looked like in that house growing up. When I was small, my birthday meant exactly 1 candle. Not a cute tradition, not a 1 big number candle kind of thing, 1 single birthday candle jammed into a grocery store cupcake my mother grabbed on her way home from work. A cupcake she then left sweating on the kitchen counter while she took a phone call that always mattered more than I did. Meanwhile, 3 weeks later, my cousin Tyler would get an entire rented bounce house and a hired caterer passing around little canapes on silver trays, because Tyler belonged to my Aunt Carla, and Tyler was blood. I remember being 8 years old and asking if I could have a party too. My aunt was over that day, drinking a glass of my mother's wine, and she answered for her before my mother even opened her mouth. "We can only really do 1 nice thing a month, sweetheart," she said, so gently, like she was doing me a favor by explaining it. That sentence taught me more than almost anything else that happened in that entire house. It taught me exactly how kind a person's voice can sound while they are calmly explaining how small you're allowed to be. So I did the math myself, the way kids do. A cupcake costs less than a party. A daughter who asks for less is cheaper than a daughter who expects the same treatment as everyone else. By the time I turned 9, I'd already stopped asking for cake, because I understood, in whatever way a 9-year-old understands anything, that being easy to manage was the only currency I had that anyone in that house actually valued. I never let myself think of it as sad. I called it efficient. That's the trick of growing up as the useful one instead of the loved one. You don't notice you've been quietly priced your whole life until somebody finally reads the number out loud to your face. And sitting at that white tablecloth at the amber light, 25 years old, I could feel my mother getting ready to do exactly that. I moved out the week I turned 18. 2 duffel bags, no ride to the bus station, and an acceptance letter to community college that I had filled out entirely on my own, with nobody's help and nobody's permission. I worked the overnight shift at a pharmacy counter and took morning classes, then transferred into a state school and finished a paralegal program while waitressing on the weekends to cover it. I paid for every bit of it myself. I'm not telling you that to sound impressive. I'm telling you because it matters enormously for what comes later. Nobody ever handed me a single thing. By 25, I was a paralegal at a downtown trusts and estates firm, and I was genuinely good at the job. My whole career is built around organizing what happens to somebody's life and somebody's money after they can no longer hold onto either one. I draft the unglamorous pages that quietly decide everything: who gets named, who gets paid, who gets left holding nothing, long after the funeral flowers have wilted in the vase. I can read a trust document the way some people read a face. And here's the joke of my entire life, the one that took me years to actually laugh at. I could sit across from a total stranger, a grieving widow, and calmly explain exactly what she was legally owed and exactly what she wasn't. I could set a flawless boundary for somebody I'd met an hour earlier. But I could not, for the life of me, get my own family to simply want me around. There was exactly one person in that family who ever made me feel like a daughter instead of a line item on somebody's ledger, and that was my grandmother, Opel. Opel was my father's mother, and she had opinions about everything and apologized for absolutely nothing. When I was 12 and sobbing in her kitchen because Tyler had told me I wasn't a real Vance, she set down her dish towel, took my chin in her hand, looked me dead in the eye, and said the sentence that would end up carrying me through the next 13 years of my life. "You were chosen, sweetheart, not collected." Then she made me a grilled cheese sandwich and let me stay up way past my bedtime watching bad television, and for one evening the whole world felt survivable. I called her every single Sunday at 4 o'clock, all through college and long after. Rain or shine. She was the one person in that family who picked up the phone like she'd genuinely been sitting there waiting for it to ring. Grandma Opel died when I was 23. I gave the only eulogy at her funeral that talked about who she actually was instead of what she'd left behind in a bank account. And within a month, one single month, my parents quietly packed up their cramped little split level and moved into a much larger house, the one that had belonged to the family for generations, the one whose name on the deed connected to Opel in ways I wouldn't fully understand until much, much later. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. I was grieving. I didn't have room in my head to be suspicious of moving trucks. But there was one thing Opel had said to me during one of our final Sunday calls, her voice thin and papery over the line, that I filed away without truly understanding it. "I made sure," she told me, "that you will never, ever have to ask anybody for your own life." I took it as encouragement. A grandmother's pep talk to a granddaughter: be strong, stand on your own 2 feet. It would take me another 6 months after her death and one long afternoon in the county records office to learn that she had meant that sentence completely literally, notarized, in writing. The year before I turned 25, my family started going quiet around me, and I don't mean the comfortable, easy kind of quiet. Texts that used to bounce back within an hour started taking 3 days. My mother stopped looping me in on the family holiday planning thread, then acted genuinely stunned when I showed up to Thanksgiving without a dish, since nobody had bothered to ask me to bring one. My Aunt Carla, meanwhile, got louder. She started using a specific word in the family group chat that she'd never once bothered with before. Blood. As in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake house. As in, the cabin only sleeps 8, so we're keeping it to blood this year, you understand? I understood completely. I just didn't have the paperwork yet to explain why the temperature in that family had dropped so sharply, all in the same season. Families drift apart slowly. Sure, that's normal, that's life. This wasn't drift. This was coordinated. And the analytical part of my brain, the part trained to notice patterns in other people's financial disasters, kept quietly raising a flag. It's the same feeling you get when 3 completely unrelated invoices land on your desk on the exact same Tuesday, and you slowly realize they aren't unrelated at all. So when my phone lit up one evening that March with my mother's name attached to a voice about 3 degrees warmer than anything I'd heard from her in over a year, I did not feel flattered. I felt a small, cold click, a lock turning shut somewhere I couldn't see yet. "Honey," she said. She only ever called me honey when she wanted something from me. We'd like to take you out and celebrate 25 properly. The way we really never quite managed to before. Every single instinct sharpened by 4 years of reading other people's worst days screamed the same warning at me. This is too clean. This is too neat. Somebody wrote the scene in advance. Here's what most people get wrong about a woman like my mother. They assume the cruelty is loud. It isn't. The cruelty is the planning. The cruelty is a woman who never once, not one single time, managed to remember a birthday cake, suddenly reserving a private corner table and dressing it up as celebrating you properly. When Renata Vance turns generous out of nowhere, it's because somewhere, on some spreadsheet only she can see, the generosity is projected to pay for itself. I had watched that pattern play out my entire life. I had simply never been the line item under investigation before. So I said yes, sweetly, exactly the way she'd trained me to. Then I hung up the phone, sat alone at my kitchen table for a long, long time, and I did what I do best. I thought about timelines. I thought about that big new house. I thought about the word blood suddenly appearing in a group chat at exactly this point in the year. And I thought about one sentence my grandmother had said to me before she died. And then I thought about a manila folder already sitting in my work bag, the one I'd put together 6 months earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother at all, and everything to do with finally learning where I actually came from. I did not call my parents back with a list of questions. I did not warn a single soul that I'd already been to the county clerk's office. Instead, I made a few calls of my own. Quiet ones. The kind you make once you've decided you refuse to be ambushed. You're going to walk in ready instead. I won't tell you yet who I called. But I'll tell you the one rule my grandmother taught me without ever saying it out loud. When my mother turned sweet, somebody at that table is about to lose something. I simply made absolutely sure, this time, it wasn't going to be me. If you've ever felt that exact cold click feeling, when kindness from the wrong person suddenly feels like a trap closing, drop a comment below. I want to know I'm not the only one who's lived this. Now, let's get back to that parking lot, because that's where things really start moving. People hear a story like this and assume it's about the money. I understand why. There's a house, there's a will, there's a folder sliding across a tablecloth. But sitting in my car outside the amber light that night, engine off, hands resting steady on the wheel, the thing I was genuinely terrified of losing had absolutely no dollar figure attached to it. I was afraid of losing the last idea I had left that I belonged anywhere at all. Because no matter how cold that house had been, no matter how transactional every candle and every casserole and every one nice thing a month had felt growing up, it was still the only origin story I had ever known. They were still, on paper, my parents. And if they cut that thread tonight, the way I fully suspected they were about to, then I would become exactly what Tyler had called me at 12 years old. Not a real Vance. Just a girl somebody picked up off a shelf and could set back down whenever they got tired of carrying her. That's the exact wound they were aiming for. They knew it, because it's the same wound they had been quietly pressing on for my entire life. What they didn't know is that the wound had already closed. 6 months can do that to you, if the right people happen to find you first. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, tucked the folder tight under my arm, and walked across that parking lot with the strange, settled calm of a woman who has already read the final page of a story everyone else in the room still believes is unfinished. I wasn't walking into a disownment. I was walking into a goodbye I had already chosen for myself months ago. They simply didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anybody said a true word out loud. My mother made small talk about the wine list. My father retold a parking story he'd already told once in the car on the way over. And then, somewhere between the bread basket and an entree nobody at that table would end up eating, my mother folded her hands together and shifted her voice into the register I know better than any other sound in the world. It's the voice she used the year she returned a Christmas gift right in front of me and explained, in detail, why it hadn't been practical. "We've always done our very best for you," she began. My father nodded along, half a second behind her, the way he'd been nodding half a second behind her for 30 straight years. "We gave you a roof over your head. An education. More than plenty of children ever get." I let her keep talking. I rested one hand flat on top of the manila folder beside my plate, and I watched my father's eyes flick down toward it and away, quick, like it burned him to look directly at it. The folder had a typed label on the tab, and just the very top edge of the text was peeking above my fingers. He could make out 4 letters if he tried hard enough. And he tried. I covered the rest with my thumb, not to hide it from him exactly. Just to let the not knowing work on him a little longer. My mother kept going about sacrifice, about how a child should understand the true cost of being raised. I thought about a sweating grocery store cupcake and a single candle, and I said absolutely nothing. Then she paused, took a small, deliberate sip of wine, set the glass down with the precision of a woman hitting a mark she'd rehearsed. And she said the line that cracked the entire evening wide open. "There's something, Kelly, that you should have been told a long time ago. A beat. You're adopted." She said it the exact way you'd casually announce a change to a dinner reservation. "We adopted you when you were an infant. You were never biologically ours. I want you to know we never planned on keeping that from you forever." She watched my face the whole time she said it. She was waiting for the collapse. This entire evening had been engineered, brick by brick, to land right here, the exact second her adopted daughter learned she'd been a stranger the whole time, and shattered into pieces small enough to sweep up and quietly leave behind. She leaned in, almost gentle now, and delivered the sentence I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens for the rest of my life. "We only kept you for the benefits." And she smiled when she said it. That smile was the detail that finally set me free, not the cruelty itself. I'd been raised on cruelty. I could absorb cruelty in my sleep. It was the smile. A person does not smile while delivering the worst news of somebody's entire life unless she has rehearsed that exact moment enough times to actually enjoy performing it. And in that smile, I finally saw the whole shape of my childhood laid bare. I hadn't been a disappointing daughter all those years. I had been an asset that had simply finished depreciating. Benefits is a very clean word for a very dirty arrangement. My father, to his eternal discredit, tried to explain it to me like an accountant defending a shaky tax position. There were assistance payments in the early years, Martin said, not meeting my eyes once. The adoption came with a small monthly subsidy while you were little. That ran dry a long time ago, back when you were still in grade school. There were tax considerations after that. And there was your grandmother, of course, though he was careful never to say her name directly. She had certain expectations about family. Taking you and helped us meet those expectations. And meeting them turned out to be, in his careful accountant's phrasing, worthwhile, for a good number of years. I sat completely still and let the arithmetic of my whole childhood quietly rearrange itself into its true, final equation. The single cupcake. The hand-me-downs from Tyler that still had Carla's original return tag stapled to them. The way the heat in my bedroom always got turned down first, every single winter. They hadn't been struggling financially at all, had they? They had simply been pocketing the difference between what raising a child actually costs and what that child generates in return. I had been the generator. "We invested in you," my father said, like that single sentence settled the entire matter, as though a daughter were nothing more than a rental property depreciating on somebody's spreadsheet. And then my mother, growing impatient with his bookkeeping, cut straight to the sentence sitting underneath every other sentence of the night. "The subsidy's been gone since you were a child, Kelly. And whatever came after that, it ends today. You're 25 now. There is simply nothing further that keeping you around does for us." She said it almost with regret, the exact tone you'd used to mention a coupon had expired. "You're not useful anymore." 2 sentences, and they had reduced an entire quarter-century of being their daughter down to a line item that had stopped producing income. I reached for my water glass. My hand did not shake. I noticed that, actually noticed it in real time, and I quietly filed it away as a small, surprising gift I hadn't expected to receive that night. Then my father did the thing he'd actually driven over there to do. He reached into the leather portfolio he'd brought, the one I had genuinely assumed held a birthday card, and he slid a thin stack of papers across the tablecloth until it bumped my plate. "We've already filed," he said, "to formalize things. You won't be named in the will. You won't be a beneficiary on anything of ours. We wanted to do this cleanly, in person, so there'd be no confusion later on." He'd clearly rehearsed the word cleanly. I could hear the lawyer who'd coached him into saying it. And here, right here, is the part my family has never once managed to understand, the part that quietly turned the entire evening in my favor without me saying a single word out loud. It took me about 4 seconds to read the caption at the top of that first page, the same way I've read 1,000 documents just like it professionally, and I understood immediately, completely, exactly what they had done. They had filed against the wrong instrument entirely. They had spent real money cutting me out of an estate that barely mattered, while leaving completely untouched the one document that actually controlled everything. They genuinely believed the power in that room ran through their modest little will. So that's exactly where they'd aimed their expensive, carefully sharpened little knife. I didn't correct them. You never tell the other side they filed suit against the wrong defendant. You let them finish talking first. So I slid the papers 1 quiet inch back toward the center of the table, not accepting them, not refusing them either, and I let my parents keep believing, for just a little bit longer, that they had already won. If you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't yet. We've got a long way to go, and it gets so much better. Stick with me. Across the table, my Aunt Carla's voice suddenly crackled to life on speakerphone from inside my mother's purse, because of course Carla was already listening in. Because Carla had been the architect behind a solid half of this entire plan. Blood looks after blood, Callie, she said, warm as a knife hidden inside soup. You've always understood that. I didn't cry. I want to be completely honest with you. Some part of me had genuinely expected to. Some 12-year-old girl still living somewhere inside my chest had been bracing herself for this exact dinner table ever since the day Tyler told her she wasn't a real anything. But 25-year-old me just took a slow, unhurried sip of water and set the glass back down without a single sound. And I watched something cross my mother's face that I had genuinely never once seen there before in my entire life. Disappointment. Not at me, at the performance. She had written this entire scene with a sobbing, shattered girl in the lead role, and the girl in front of her simply refused to sob, and it was quietly ruining her ending. Aren't you going to say anything? She finally asked, and there was a real edge in it now, the brittleness of a woman watching her own carefully written script fly completely off the rails. I considered the question. I considered the entire flood of everything I could have said, 25 years worth of it backed up behind one small dam. And then she made the exact mistake people like her always end up making. She filled the silence herself by reaching for the same line that had worked the first time, fully expecting it to land the same way twice. We only kept you for the benefits, she repeated slower this time, leaning hard on every single word, trying to draw out the same blood she'd drawn the first time. But a sentence loses every one of its teeth the second time you hear it come out of the same mouth. The first time, it had been a genuine revelation. The second time, it was just a confession. And it wasn't a confession about me anymore. It told me absolutely everything about who she really was, and nothing whatsoever about my own worth. I set my napkin back in my lap, smoothed it once, and let her sit there and watch me not break. That's when, behind her, at table 9, I saw a woman with my exact chin slowly turn her head toward our table and go completely, perfectly still. To explain what was actually sitting inside that folder, I need to take you back 6 months, to the week 2 separate envelopes landed in my mailbox and quietly rewrote the entire math of my life. The first one I'd been waiting for, half convinced nothing would ever come of it. After Grandma Opel died, I'd finally registered with the state's Voluntary Adoption Reunion Registry. 8 weeks later, an envelope showed up addressed in careful, looping handwriting I didn't recognize, the handwriting of somebody who had clearly practiced exactly what she wanted to say before she ever picked up a pen. It was from a woman named Lena Hale. She wrote that she'd been 19 years old when she gave me up. That she hadn't wanted to. That she had thought about me every single March for 25 years straight. And that if I ever wanted to meet her, she would drive any distance, on any day, with absolutely no expectations attached. She signed her name, and underneath it, she added one more line, the line I read so many times the paper actually started going soft in my hands. I never stopped saving you a seat. The second envelope arrived 3 days later, and at first it had nothing to do with Lena at all, or so I thought. Our state had only just recently started opening original birth records to adult adoptees once they turned 21, provided they filed through that same reunion registry, and I'd submitted my own request the very same week Lena's letter arrived. While I sat waiting on that one, out of pure professional habit, the way a dentist can't help glancing at a stranger's teeth, I requested a copy of the file on Grandma Opel's estate. And there it was, buried inside the distribution schedule of what was formerly called the Opel Vance Family Trust, executed a full 2 years before she died. Administered not by my parents at all, but by an outside bank trustee they had absolutely no control over. The caregiver distributions to Martin and Renata Vance shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Callie. Not their estate. Hers. Held by a trustee my parents couldn't touch, scheduled to slip out of their hands forever on the exact date they had, coincidentally, chosen for that celebration dinner. 2 envelopes, 1 single week. One told me exactly where I had come from. The other told me, in my own grandmother's notarized handwriting, precisely what my parents were about to lose and exactly why they were suddenly in such a screaming hurry. I did not call my mother and detonate the discovery down the phone line. That has never been my weapon, and it's not one I trust in anyone's hands. I've watched too many families lose everything over one satisfying outburst that a lawyer later turns into evidence against them. What I had instead was process. So I used process. I took a personal day off work, drove the trust paperwork to an estate attorney who had zero connection to my family, and paid her out of my own personal savings to confirm what I already strongly suspected. The caregiver distributions were completely legitimate, currently active, and about to end. My parents had been quietly drawing a monthly sum for the better part of 2 decades for raising me and living rent-free in a house that same trust had funded the entire time. The remainder, on my 25th birthday, would pass directly to me through that corporate trustee, and there was nothing whatsoever my parents could file, sign, or shred to stop it. Their will was completely irrelevant to any of it. Their entire disownment plan was theater, performed on exactly the wrong stage. My attorney asked if I wanted to get ahead of it. Notify them early. Soften the landing somehow. I told her no. I told her I wanted exactly 3 things placed in one folder, and nothing else. A retainer letter, so they'd know, in writing, that I already had legal counsel. The trust's distribution schedule, so they could see the date sitting right there in black and white. And my original birth certificate, with Lena Hale's name printed where my mother had always assumed her own name belonged, so that when the moment finally came, that entire table would understand, instantly, exactly which family I was choosing to walk away from, and exactly which one I was choosing to keep. I labeled the tab. I closed the folder. I put it in my bag, and I carried it around quietly for 6 full months, like an engine I hadn't turned the key on yet. That dinner invitation only told me precisely when. I met Lena Hale for the very first time in a diner sitting roughly halfway between our 2 cities, because she didn't want me to have to drive too far on my own. That one small consideration undid me more completely than any grand speech ever could have. She was nervous. She'd brought along a photo album that she kept opening and closing without actually showing me, like she wasn't fully sure yet whether she'd earned the right. She had my exact chin, and my exact habit of going quiet whenever I felt something too big to say out loud. Over the following 6 months, we built something carefully, the way you'd repair a bridge while you're still standing on it. I learned I had a half-brother named Miles, 20 years old, all elbows and endless questions, who started sending me memes within a week of meeting me, like I'd simply always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, ferocious woman named Vivian, who took one look at me the first time we met and said, "Well, there she is," like I'd merely been running late somewhere, not gone for a quarter of a century. They never once asked me for anything. That was the part my entire nervous system genuinely could not process. No favors. No money. No role I needed to perform to earn my seat at their table. Lena told me something the 3rd time we met that would go on to become the truest sentence of my entire life. "We've kept a seat for you, sweetheart," she said. "We never gave it away to anyone else." And me, a woman who could draft a flawless beneficiary clause for a complete stranger, who understood the precise legal language of belonging better than almost anyone, sat in a vinyl diner booth and had absolutely no idea what to do with my own 2 hands, because for the first time in my life, I was wanted by people who stood to gain literally nothing from wanting me. After 25 years of being useful, I genuinely did not know how to simply be welcome. I was about to have to learn fast. There's a real difference between being needed and being wanted. I had only ever known one of those 2 things. Being needed, I understood down to the bone. Being needed is a job. You show up, you produce, you keep yourself easy to manage, you keep the math simple for everyone else, and in exchange you get to keep your seat at the table for another quarter. I'd been needed my entire life, and I had mistaken the steadiness of that arrangement for love, the same way you can mistake a long, grinding commute for an actual destination just because you make the same drive every single day. What Lena and Miles and Vivian offered me had no job attached to it whatsoever, and that terrified me far more than my own mother ever had. The first time Lena called just to ask how my week had gone, with absolutely no agenda hiding underneath the question, I spent the entire phone call waiting for the catch. When there wasn't one, I had to pull my car over to the shoulder because I couldn't see the road anymore through my own eyes. I tested them over and over in small, ungenerous little ways I'm not proud of admitting to you now. I'd cancel plans just to see if they'd punish me for it. They never did. They'd just say, "No worries, next time," and mean every word of it. I'd try to pay for everything, constantly, desperate to make myself useful enough to earn my place at the table. Vivian finally took my face in both her hands, the exact way Opel used to, and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here, sweetheart. We already paid." And slowly, over those 6 months, a knot I had been carrying inside my chest since I was 9 years old began, not to disappear entirely, but to loosen. I started to believe, against 25 years of hard evidence to the contrary, that a person could simply want me in the room. No strings. No invoice. So when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 25 properly, I already knew exactly where I wanted to spend that evening. I just decided I wanted to spend it in 2 places at once. Here's who I called first. The night my mother booked the Amber Light, I called Lena, and I asked her a question I had been far too afraid to ask anyone in my life up to that point. Would you come to my birthday dinner? I explained the entire shape of it to her. My parents. My suspicions. The trust. The speech I could already feel building on the horizon. I told her I had no idea exactly what they were planning to say to me, but I knew, with total certainty, that I did not want to sit there and absorb it alone. And I knew I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were clearly counting on me to hand them. Lena did not hesitate for even a single second. What time and where, she said. And should we dress up? Then she added something that made me clap a hand over my own mouth, alone, in my kitchen. We would be honored, she told me, to watch you not need them. So I made one more phone call, this one straight to the Amber Light, and I booked a second table for that same evening under my own name. Kelly Vance, party of 3. Table 9, the host told me. Toward the back. 3 tables behind the reservation, already on the books for a Vance party of 3 up front. I nearly laughed out loud at the geometry of it. They had absolutely no idea they were about to perform my disownment in full view of the exact family that had spent 25 years quietly saving me a chair. I told Lena and Vivian and Miles to arrive a little bit after us, to order quietly, to simply exist in the room, and to let me come find them when I was finally ready. I won't pretend to you that I didn't want them there. I did. There's a very specific reason the truth lands so much harder spoken out loud in front of witnesses than mailed out later in a private letter. A private confrontation only ever becomes one person's word against another's. So yes, I wanted witnesses in that room, and I'm not ashamed to admit it now. But Lena and Vivian and Miles were never simply witnesses to me. That was the entire difference between what they were about to do that night and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I'd make my parents finally understand they had already lost. Table 9 was where I would go to remember I had already won, long before anybody sat down to order drinks. Back at the front table, in the present moment, my mother decided the silence had dragged on long enough, and she moved in to close the deal. She pulled one more page from that leather portfolio and turned it to face me, uncapping a pen and laying it neatly across the paper like some small, thoughtful gift. It's just an acknowledgement, she said, that we've informed you. That you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a perfectly civilized dinner and go our separate ways afterward. I looked down at the page. I didn't even need to read very far. The release paragraph opened with the exact boilerplate language I'd personally typed 100 times before in my own job. The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy. And the rest did exactly what that kind of language is always built to do. It wasn't an acknowledgement at all. It was a waiver wearing an acknowledgement's clothes. A tidy little document engineered to get me to agree, on the record, that I had been properly notified and had no remaining claim to anything. Exactly the kind of thing a careful lawyer drafts specifically to head off the challenge I was, in that exact moment, in a perfect position to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding from the reveal, before the shock could wear off enough for me to actually think clearly. It's a classic move. I have personally watched grieving people sign away entire fortunes at kitchen tables because somebody slid a pen across at exactly the right wounded second. My mother was counting on my wound to do her work for her. She had absolutely no idea that wound came pre-attached to a trust document she couldn't touch. I left the pen exactly where it lay. My father, across from me, kept sneaking glances at my manila folder, and I watched the worry climb slowly up his neck in a creeping red tide. Martin had always been the one who actually understood where the family's money really lived. He'd seen the 4 letters peeking above the folders tab. He was doing the arithmetic now, the exact same arithmetic I had already done 6 months earlier, and I could tell the answer was beginning to genuinely frighten him. Is there, he started, then stopped himself. Is there something we should know, Callie? I gave him the first real smile of the entire night. Not yet, I said. That's when my Aunt Carla arrived in person, Cousin Tyler trailing behind her, both of them wearing the exact expression of people staging surprise after clearly having waited it out in the bar with their phones ready. Kelly. What a coincidence, Carla said, pressing a cold cheek against mine, and I understood instantly that my mother had summoned reinforcements. Renata always did like an audience for her best material, especially an audience that would nod along and apply extra pressure if I dared to get difficult. Carla pulled up an extra chair without being invited to, because subtlety was never, ever her instrument. "We just want what's best for the family," she said, laying a manicured hand over my mother's. "And families sometimes have to make hard choices about who's really a part of them. You've always been such a practical girl, Callie. You understand that blood looks after blood." There it was again. That word, the one she'd been seeding in the family group chat all year long, finally spoken out loud at the exact table it had been built for. I looked at my aunt, the same woman who had answered for my mother when I was 8 and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a party, and I felt the very last thread of obligation inside me finally go slack. These were not people I was in danger of losing. These were people I was finally, gloriously setting down. I had carried them a long way, much longer than they had ever earned, and my arms were finally, wonderfully tired. Across the table, my father wasn't joining in on any of it. He was staring down at his own hands. And then, while Carla was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, he leaned toward me and said something low, just for me. "Your grandmother loved you," my father said quietly, underneath Carla's chatter. He stopped there. For one brief second, I saw an entirely different version of Martin Vance, the version that might have existed if he had ever, even once, chosen the harder right thing over the easier comfortable one. His eyes had gone wet. He had loved his mother. I know that much was genuinely true, and some part of him clearly understood that the woman he loved had built an entire wall of money around me specifically because she didn't trust her own son to protect me on his own. That had to be a genuinely awful thing to sit with at a dinner table in real time. I waited. I truly waited, because there was a version of that evening where my father said the next sentence, the apology, the "I'm sorry, this is wrong, I won't do this," and I would have heard it, and it would have mattered enormously to me. But he looked over at my mother, who was watching him the exact way a handler watches a dog that started wandering too close to the road, and I watched him make his choice. He sat back. He picked his water glass back up. And the almost sentence died quietly in his throat, right alongside every other almost sentence he'd let die there over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at the front table offered me the entire night, and it lasted exactly 4 words and 1 swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You honestly can't hate a man for turning out to be exactly the way you always knew he was. But I understood, finally, completely, why they had filed everything in such a screaming rush, why the whole evening had been engineered to move so cruelly fast. The answer was sitting right there behind his wet eyes. He knew about Opel's trust. He had known the date was coming for a very long time. And he had hoped, desperately, to get my signature on that waiver before I ever found out what his own mother had quietly done to protect me. So I asked him a single question. Not loudly. Not as his daughter. I asked it in the exact voice I used back at the firm, the one reserved for the moment I found the fatal flaw in someone's filing, and I'm giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves first. "Dad," I said, "which instrument did you file under? Your estate or Grandma's trust?" The table went quiet in a way it had never once been quiet before. My mother's wine glass paused halfway to her mouth. Carla's manicured hand froze mid-pat. My father blinked at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a language he half recognized from a country he had never actually visited, because in 11 words, I had just told all 3 of them something they had not budgeted for. That I knew there was a genuine difference between the 2 documents. That I knew exactly which one actually mattered. And that I had known it long enough to have learned the vocabulary cold. My mother had never once heard me speak in that voice before. None of them had. To every single person at that table, I had always been the quiet one. The easy one. The girl who took the smaller slice so the whole table could stay pleasant and comfortable. They had built this entire evening around one core assumption, that I would simply receive whatever fate they handed me, not audit it. "What?" my mother said, and it came out much smaller than she'd meant it to. "What are you talking about?" I let the question sit there untouched for a long moment. I've learned over the years that the single most powerful thing in any room is the one person who does not feel any need to rush toward an answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth, lined it up neatly with the edge of the manila folder, and I looked at my father, pale now, already knowing, silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. No show. No flourish, no slam-down documents, no dramatic speech. I simply turned the folder to face them and laid 3 pages out side by side on the white cloth, the exact way I'd lay exhibits in front of a client who genuinely needed to understand their own legal situation. The retainer letter, first, firm letterhead, the unmistakable line confirming I already had legal counsel of my own. The distribution schedule from the Opel Vance Family Trust. Second, the relevant paragraph sitting right there in plain black and white for anybody at that table to read for themselves. And third, my original birth certificate with Lena Hale's name printed in the space where my mother had always assumed her own name belonged. I didn't point at a single word. I let the paper do exactly what paper always does. My mother's eyes went straight to the trust schedule first, because of course they did. Some animal part of her had always known precisely where the family's money actually slept. I watched her read it. I watched the words physically go in. The caregiver distributions to Martin and Renata Vance shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Callie. I watched her reach the word remainder, and then my own name, and I watched the color drain right out of her face from the top down, like a window shade slowly being drawn shut. She looked up at me, then over at my father, then back down at the page, the exact way people look when they're silently hoping a second reading might say something kinder than the first one did. It never does. It never once does. Mom, I said gently, because I could finally afford to be gentle. You filed against the wrong family. The one you cut me out of was always the smaller one. My mother is a fast woman, and I'll give her that much credit even now. It took her roughly 10 seconds to assemble the entire picture, and I watched her do it in real time. The bigger house, funded by a trust she'd assumed she would live inside forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly furnished her entire comfortable life, and that ended, by their own terms, that very night. The remainder, the real money, the part she had spent 2 decades standing right next to and never once controlling, passing on this exact date to the exact daughter she had just finished telling was no longer useful. And the waiver, her clever little waiver, that I had come within seconds of signing, that would have been worth precisely nothing at all, because it released a claim against an estate that was never actually where the value lived. She had aimed every single weapon she owned at a will, and missed the actual trust entirely. The cruelty had cost her nothing. The mistake was about to cost her everything. And here's the very last thing my mother ever taught me, whether she meant to or not. People like her never apologize the moment they get caught. They pivot instead. Her whole face rearranged itself right in front of me. The cold drained out and a terrible warmth flooded in behind it. She reached across the table for my hand. Callie, she said, and her voice had gone soft and wet and maternal in a way it had never once been when being maternal actually cost her something. We're still your parents. Whatever's in those papers, that doesn't change what we are. We're family. The word family, coming from the exact same mouth that had told me, 20 minutes earlier, we only kept you for the benefits. I looked at her hand reaching for mine, and I did not take it. The very same sentence that had been her weapon all evening had, in this new light, become my clearance to leave. People always expect this is the part where I made them pay. Where I detailed exactly how much the remainder was worth out loud, watched them squirm, maybe ordered the most expensive item on the entire menu, and left them stuck with the bill. I understand that appetite completely. I've felt it myself. But I want to tell you the actual truth about power, because I handle it professionally for a living. The strongest position in any room is never the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that doesn't actually need the number at all. I already had a career I'd built entirely with my own 2 hands. I had savings I'd earned waitressing tables and drafting documents at 2 in the morning. I did not need Grandma Opel's remainder to feel free. And that fact, more than any dollar figure ever could, was the one thing my mother could not survive fully understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the 3 pages back inside it unhurried. And I picked up the pen they had brought along for my surrender, and I set it back down, neatly, beside my mother's plate. I had already won the thing they thought they were fighting me over, long before any of them ever sat down at that table. And I had won it by preparing. By knowing. By simply refusing to be ambushed. There was nothing left to argue about. There was only the question of where I wanted to spend the rest of my birthday. And I had made that choice 6 months earlier, in a vinyl diner booth, when a nervous woman with my exact chin slid a photo album across a table and never once asked me for a single thing in return. I stood up. I did it the same way you'd rise from any other table, no drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for her folder. But the effect on the front table was immediate and total. My mother's hand was still hanging in the air where mine should have landed. "Sit down," she said, and the soft maternal mask slipped clean off, the old cold control snapping back into her voice like a bone locking into place. "Sit down, Callie. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Carla straightened up in her chair. Tyler, for once in his life, actually stopped smirking. My father just looked exhausted, the exact look of a man watching the one genuinely good thing his own mother ever did walk permanently out of his reach. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest, and I looked at my mother, the same woman who had spent an entire expensive dinner trying to convince me I had no real place anywhere in this world, and I told her, in the plainest words I owned, exactly where I was headed. My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you. I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. It had been true for the entire meal. True while she smiled and rehearsed her lines and slid a waiver across the tablecloth. True the whole time. She had genuinely believed she was performing my disownment for an audience of total strangers. She had actually been performing it within arm's reach of the exact people who had been quietly saving me a chair since long before she ever decided I'd stopped being useful. And I watched those words travel clean across the table and land. I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn around in her seat. She turned the way you turn when some part of you already knows exactly what's coming and is silently begging the rest of you to be wrong. Her charcoal gray shoulders rotated. Her chin came around. And there at table 9, 3 tables back, sitting under warm, low light, were Lena and Vivian and Miles, who had been in that room the entire time, who had ordered quietly and barely touched their food, who had watched my mother deliver the worst sentences of my entire life, and who had kept their seats and their composure because I had personally asked them to let me come to them when I was ready. Lena met my mother's eyes first. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at the woman who had raised her daughter on 1 candle and a calculator, and then she looked back at me, and her whole face opened up like a window in early spring. Vivian, small, fierce Vivian, already had her napkin folded neatly beside her plate ready. Miles had finally stopped pretending to look at his phone. My mother's gaze traveled from Lena's chin to mine and back again, doing the resemblance math in real time. And I watched the exact moment she finally understood that the family she had just spent the last 20 minutes telling me I didn't have was sitting 15 feet behind her, in real chairs, at a real table, having just watched her do the one thing she could never take back, in front of witnesses she never knew existed. She turned back to face me. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the very first time in my entire life, my mother had absolutely no script left to read from. And in the silence where her next cruel line should have landed, a chair scraped back at table 9. All 3 of them stood up, not to make any kind of scene, not to confront anybody, just to be on their feet by the time I crossed the room to reach them, the way you'd rise for someone arriving through a gate after a very long flight. Vivian stood first, because Vivian does absolutely everything first. Then Lena. Then Miles, banging his knee against the table leg in his hurry to get up. They didn't say a single word to my parents. They didn't have to. Simply standing said the entire thing that needed saying. The restaurant had gone quiet all around us, that particular hush strangers fall into when they can feel something genuinely true happening nearby, and they've stopped pretending not to watch. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray balanced on his hand. And I walked past my mother, still turned half around in her chair, past Carla, whose mouth had finally run completely out of the word blood, past my father, who lifted his eyes to meet mine as I passed, and then dropped them again, choosing comfort one final time. 15 feet. 3 tables. 25 years. When I reached them, Vivian took my face in both her hands, the exact same way Opel used to, and Lena pulled out the empty 4th chair sitting beside her own. The one they had asked the host to set for me even though their reservation had only ever been booked for 3. "We saved you a seat," she said, the very same words she'd written under her name in that first letter, the words that had gone soft in my hands from reading them over and over. "We always did." And I sat down in it. In the seat that had genuinely been waiting for me my entire life, at a table that had wanted me long before it ever knew whether I would actually show up. That's when my mother lost the one thing she had never once lost in front of other people, her composure. I heard her chair scrape back. I heard her stand up. I heard the carefully polished calm she'd worn all evening crack straight down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, and it wasn't quiet anymore. It carried, sharp and rising, clean across the entire dining room. "After everything we did for you, the schools, the roof, the years you do this to us? In public? You humiliate your own family over money." Heads turned openly now. A man at the bar set his drink down without finishing his sip. Carla was tugging hard at my mother's sleeve, hissing under her breath, "Renata, sit down. People are looking." But my mother was past the reach of her own handler for the very first time in her life, because the script was gone, and all she had left was the truth, coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she announced to a room full of complete strangers. And I noticed, even now, even cornered, she said, gave, not loved. Even in that moment, The word love simply would not come, because it had never once actually been in the inventory. I stayed seated at table 9. I didn't stand up to match her energy. I didn't raise my own voice to meet hers. Lena's hand had already found mine under the table, and I simply held onto it and let my mother be loud, because the loudness was doing every bit of my remaining work for me. Every single person in that restaurant was watching one calm young woman, seated quietly among people who clearly adored her, sitting 15 feet away from a furious older woman screaming about everything she'd paid for. And there is not one human being alive who hears a parent screaming publicly about money and thinks, there's the real family. My father never stood up at all. He simply put his face in his hands. I let her run all the way out of words, the way a storm eventually runs out of rain. And once the quiet finally came back into the room, I did one last thing before I gave the rest of my attention over to my actual family. I stood, walked the 3 tables back up to the front, and set a single page down on the white tablecloth in front of her, the trust's distribution schedule. I left it face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals safely on file, and I wanted my mother to have something to read on what was, without question, the longest evening of her entire life. You can keep this one, I told her. You'll want to understand exactly what ended tonight and what didn't. She stared down at the page. My father reached toward it, then stopped himself and didn't. I looked at the two of them one final time, my mother, the woman who had priced her own daughter at one grocery store candle, and my father, the man who had loved his own mother too much to ever honor what she'd asked of him. And I said the one sentence I had actually prepared in advance, the one I'd written out in my head in that parking lot and promised myself I would only use if I truly earned the right to say it. You kept me for the benefits, I said. They kept a seat for me. Then I turned around, and I walked back to table 9, and I did not look behind me again. Not once. Not when Carla called out my name. Not when my mother said something I genuinely couldn't make out and didn't particularly want to. I sat back down beside Lena. Vivian had ordered me a slice of chocolate cake while I'd been gone, and Miles had already stuck the restaurant's own little birthday candle right into the center of it. A single candle, lit and flickering. For one strange second, the symmetry of it caught somewhere in my throat. Then Lena leaned over and said, "Blow it out, sweetheart. Make a wish." And I realized, sitting there, that I didn't actually have one left to make. I already had it. The trust did exactly what my grandmother built it to do. On my 25th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Martin and Renata Vance ended, on the date and under the exact terms Opel had notarized 2 full years before she died. The remainder passed to me through the bank trustee, completely untouched by the will my parents had spent good money revising, because it turns out you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you never actually controlled in the first place. Their waiver, unsigned, was worth precisely what it had always been worth. Within a year, my parents sold that big house, because without the monthly distributions propping it up, they simply couldn't afford to carry it, and they moved into something considerably smaller. I'm told Carla was absolutely furious to learn that not $1 of Opel's money would ever be flowing toward Tyler after all. The story of that dinner traveled the way these things always do, through the family first, and then well past it. But the version where Renata Vance plays the devoted, wronged mother of some ungrateful adopted daughter never quite managed to take hold, because far too many strangers at the Amber Light had personally watched a woman scream about everything she'd paid for, while a quiet young woman calmly held hands with the family sitting across the room from her. I never sued anybody. I never posted a single thing online about any of it. I simply stopped answering, and I let the silence itself become the boundary, because that is the only kind of boundary that ever actually holds. My father texted me once, a few weeks later. 3 words. "I am sorry." No signature. No follow-up message. I never replied. I heard, later, that when Carla tried to rally the rest of the family into contesting Opel's trust, it was actually my father who quietly shut the whole thing down, told them their mother had every right in the world to leave her money wherever she chose to leave it, that it was hers, and that the matter was finished. He was right. He was also, as always, a full year too late, saying it to entirely the wrong room, at the exact moment it cost him nothing and changed absolutely nothing. That was the whole of my father, in the end. A man who knew the right thing to do, who even felt it somewhere underneath everything else, and who could only ever manage to actually do it once doing it no longer required anything at all from him. I didn't need his apology, but I was glad, in some small, clean way, that he had finally said something true out loud, even if it came far too late to matter. As for the rest of it, I spent that first real birthday of my life eating chocolate cake at table 9, surrounded by people who stood to gain absolutely nothing from wanting me there. And I have spent every single birthday since then with them. Lena and I talk every Sunday now, for a clock sharp, the exact hour I used to reserve for Opel. Vivian taught me how to make her grilled cheese. Miles still sends me memes constantly. And somewhere in a kitchen drawer at my new family's house, there's a photo album that doesn't fully close anymore, because it finally has enough pages to hold everything. Being useful was the only thing my parents ever wanted from me. Being wanted was the one thing I had never once had. And it took me 25 years and one absolutely brutal dinner to finally learn that anyone who only ever keeps you around for the benefits has already told you, in the plainest language there is, that they were never actually your family at all. That's my story. One candle for 24 straight years. And on the 25th, an entire table that lit them all for me without me ever having to ask. If someone in your life only seems to value you when you're being useful, let this be your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already fully deserve. You do not have to earn the people who genuinely love you. If this one hit you the way I think it did, share it with somebody who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment, tell me which part got you the most, the folder, the candle, or table 9, and hit subscribe, because trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next.